On the afternoon of February 4, 2010, something happened in the quiet suburban community of Fallbrook, California. And that would leave investigators, friends, and an entire nation searching for answers. At first, there was because there was no sign of violence, no frantic 911 call, and no obvious crime scene.
Then instead, there was only silence. A successful business owner, his wife, and their 2 young sons.
And they seemed to have vanished without a trace, leaving behind a mystery that would remain unsolved.
Because it ended in one of the most heartbreaking criminal cases in recent American history. This is the story of the McStay Family Murders, a case that began as a missing person investigation, then ultimately became a complex homicide prosecution built on forensic evidence, digital records, and circumstantial proof. So it is also a very powerful reminder that not every disappearance has a simple explanation. And that investigators sometimes spend years assembling a case piece by piece before they can bring it to court.
Because, from the outside, the family appeared to be living a comfortable and stable life. At the center of it was a successful businessman, known to friends as Joe, operated an online business that sold decorative indoor water fountains, while his wife, Summer McStay, cared for their 2 young sons, Gianni McStay and Joseph McStay Jr.
And they lived in a home in Fallbrook, a community in Southern California known for its quiet neighborhoods.
Because of its family-oriented atmosphere, friends described Joe as ambitious and hardworking, while Summer was a devoted mother. And just like many families, they had everyday responsibilities, financial obligations, and plans for the future. But absolutely nothing publicly suggested that they were on the verge of becoming the focus of a major investigation.
And one of California's most closely watched criminal investigations. The family's last confirmed activities unfolded over the first few days.
Because of February 2010, phone records, business communications, and witness accounts helped investigators reconstruct a timeline.
And Joe continued conducting business, communicating with customers and associates about orders and ongoing projects, while Summer
remained at home caring for the children. At first, there was nothing unusual about these routine activities.
And it was only when those communications suddenly stopped that concern began to grow. Friends and business associates.
It wasn't long before those close to him realized something was unusual. A man who normally replied promptly to calls and messages had suddenly stopped communicating altogether, and customers could no longer reach him. Family members also became increasingly concerned after repeated attempts to contact, because the McStays failed. Days passed without any explanation. As concern mounted, someone decided to check on the family's home.
But what investigators found raised more questions than answers. The residence did not appear to have been ransacked.
And there were no obvious signs of a violent struggle. Personal belongings remained inside the house. Then food was still in the kitchen. The family's dogs had been left behind at the home, because friends said the McStays cared deeply for their pets. If the family had planned a trip, then why would they leave the dogs without making arrangements? If they had intended to return quickly, and why had no one heard from them? Small inconsistencies began to accumulate, and each one deepened the mystery.
So one of the earliest theories suggested the family had left voluntarily. Investigators considered whether they might have.
And traveled unexpectedly or chosen to disappear for personal reasons. Such possibilities must always be explored in missing person cases, especially during the initial stages when little information is available. However, as detectives examined the family's financial records and communication history and personal circumstances, that explanation became increasingly difficult to support. There was no verified evidence
that the family had made long-term plans to abandon their home, business, or extended family.
Then attention turned to digital evidence. In modern investigations, computers, cell phones, bank transactions, and surveillance footage
and often become silent witnesses, helping investigators reconstruct events even when no eyewitnesses exist. Detectives reviewed electronic records.
Because in an effort to determine where the McStays had gone and who they may have encountered before disappearing, but each record added another piece to the puzzle. But none immediately answered the central question. And where was the family? One development quickly captured national attention. Surveillance footage from near the US-Mexico border.
And appeared to show a family resembling the McStays crossing into Mexico on foot. The images were grainy,
but making positive identification impossible, but they prompted investigators to seriously consider whether the family had voluntarily entered Mexico.
And the possibility generated widespread media coverage and public speculation. If the people in the video truly were
Then McStay's, perhaps the disappearance was not the result of foul play after all. Yet investigators remained cautious.
Because similar appearances alone could not establish identity, and there was no additional evidence confirming that the Caucasian family
and had continued traveling beyond the border crossing. As weeks turned into months, the investigation expanded.
Then detectives interviewed relatives, friends, employees, customers, and anyone else who had recently interacted with the family.
Investigators reviewed business records and explored whether his professional activities might have been connected to unresolved disagreements or workplace-related issues.
Then they reviewed bank activity and searched for evidence that the family had withdrawn cash or used credit cards.
And after their disappearance. Each avenue was pursued methodically, but the case remained frustratingly quiet. The disappearance soon
attracted national media attention. Television programs featured the family's photographs. Missing person organizations circulated information across the country.
And viewers were struck by the image of a young family seemingly vanishing without explanation. Cases involving
Because families are exceptionally rare, making the McStay disappearance particularly unusual. 4 people, including 2 young children, had disappeared together,
and leaving investigators with almost no physical evidence pointing toward a clear suspect or destination. As the months passed,
public interest remained strong, but leads grew increasingly scarce. Investigators continued to work behind the scenes.
By revisiting earlier interviews and analyzing newly received tips, missing person investigations often involve long periods of painstaking work.
Because that receive little public attention. Detectives compare statements, verify alibis, examine phone records, and revisit evidence repeatedly.
And searching for inconsistencies that may have been overlooked. In the McStay case, that persistence would eventually prove. And in November 2013, a motorcyclist riding through a remote desert area near Victorville, California, noticed what appeared. And in November 2013, a motorcyclist riding through a remote desert area near Victorville, California, noticed what appeared. Then to be human remains partially exposed in the ground. Authorities responded to the scene and soon uncovered, and multiple shallow graves. As forensic teams carefully excavated the site, they made a tragic discovery: the remains.
Because they belonged to Joseph, Summer, Gianni, and Joseph Jr. The news transformed the investigation overnight.
And what had begun as a baffling missing person case was now officially a homicide investigation. Detectives no longer
but searched for a missing family. They searched for whoever was responsible for killing them, the remote burial site.
Then immediately raised difficult questions. Why had the victims been buried there? How had the killer transported 4
victims to such an isolated location without attracting attention? And perhaps most importantly, who had both the
Because motive and the opportunity to commit such a crime? The answers would not come quickly. Instead, investigators, and would spend years examining forensic evidence, digital records, business relationships, and witness testimony. Piece by piece, then would begin constructing a case that prosecutors later argued pointed to someone the family knew, not a random.
But stranger, but a trusted business associate whose relationship with Joseph McStay would come under increasing scrutiny.
And after the McStay family's remains were discovered in the Mojave Desert in November 2013, investigators faced a new challenge.
Because for nearly 4 years, they had been trying to determine where the family had gone.
And now they had to determine who had killed them, how the murders had been carried out,
and why an entire Latina family had been buried in shallow graves more than 100 miles from their home.
Then the remote location near Victorville immediately suggested planning and familiarity with the area. This was not a place
and someone would likely stumble upon by accident. Detectives began examining everyone who had been connected to Joseph McStay.
Because in the weeks before the disappearance, focusing especially on business associates, employees, and anyone who might have had.
Investigators also explored possible financial and personal connections. As the inquiry progressed, one individual gradually became a central focus of the investigation.
The individual had been a business associate of the missing man and had worked with him on several professional projects over the years.
Because the water fountain business. According to investigators, the 2 men had known each other for years and had conducted
business together on numerous occasions. At first, Merritt was interviewed as a potential witness, not as a suspect. Then detectives wanted to understand his relationship with Joseph, the status of their business dealings, and the last time and he had seen the family. But as investigators continued reviewing records, phone data, and financial transactions, they began
then to identify inconsistencies that drew increasing attention to him. One of the most important pieces of evidence involved time.
And prosecutors later argued that Merritt was among the last known people to have contact with Joseph before. Then the family disappeared. Phone records showed communication between the two men on February 4, 2010, the day investigators, and believed the family was killed. Detectives also discovered that Joseph's business accounts had been accessed after the family vanished. And investigators viewed these transactions as potentially significant because they suggested someone may have been attempting to benefit financially.
Because after Joseph was no longer able to manage his business, Merritt denied involvement in the murders and maintained.
As detectives dug deeper, they examined cell phone records that placed him at the scene of the crime. Then Merritt's phone in areas prosecutors considered relevant to the case. They also looked into his financial situation, arguing, and that he was experiencing money problems around the time of the murders. Prosecutors would later present this as But the defense, however, argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that investigators had focused too narrowly on Merritt. And while overlooking other possibilities, the investigation also centered on the condition of the burial site. Forensic experts determined then that the McStays had been buried in two shallow graves in a remote desert area. Joseph and Summer.
And were found in one grave, while their two young sons were found in another nearby grave. Authorities reported.
Because that blunt force trauma was a likely cause of death. A sledgehammer discovered near the graves became an important piece of physical evidence. Prosecutors argued that the weapon was connected to the murders, although the defense challenged. But the strength of that connection. One question that haunted investigators was how the killer managed to transport 4
victims without drawing attention. The family disappeared from Fallbrook, yet their bodies were found more than 100
miles away in the high desert region of California. Prosecutors theorized that the victims were killed shortly after because they vanished and then transported to the burial site. The exact sequence of events became a major focus, and during the trial, with both sides debating where the murders occurred and how the bodies were moved. As the
case moved toward court, it became one of the most closely watched murder prosecutions in California.
In time Merritt was arrested in 2014, the McStay case had already attracted national attention through television programs, news,
coverage, and true crime documentaries. Many people had followed the mystery from the beginning, believing the family had.
Because either voluntarily disappeared or crossed into Mexico. The discovery of the graves had shattered those theories and transformed, and the story into a homicide case involving an entire family, including 2 small children. The trial began years, then later and lasted for months. Prosecutors built their case largely on circumstantial evidence, arguing that all the pieces
pointed to Merritt as the killer. They presented financial records, phone data, witness testimony, and evidence related to
the altered checks. They argued that Merritt had both motive and opportunity, and that his actions after but family's disappearance were inconsistent with innocence. The defense pushed back aggressively. Merritt's attorneys argued that there was no direct eyewitness, no confession, and no definitive forensic evidence placing him at the scene of the murders. They
then questioned the prosecution's timeline, challenged interpretations of the phone records, and suggested that investigators had failed to fully
explore other suspects. The defense emphasized that circumstantial evidence, while potentially persuasive, still required the jury to infer and what had happened. One of the most emotional aspects of the trial involved the children, Gianni and Joseph Jr. So prosecutors described a crime that had wiped out an entire family, while the defense warned jurors not to.
And let emotion replace evidence. The courtroom heard testimony about the family's life before the disappearance, the search efforts,
and the eventual discovery of the graves. For many observers, the case was particularly disturbing because it involved
Because not only the murder of 2 adults, but also the deaths of 2 young boys whose lives had
only just begun. After months of testimony, the legal proceedings reached a conclusion in 2019, with the court delivering its verdict. Then of the murders of Joseph McStay, Summer McStay, Gianni McStay, and Joseph McStay Jr., the jury also found, and special circumstances related to multiple murders. During the penalty phase, prosecutors sought the death penalty, arguing that
because crime was especially grave, because it involved the killing of an entire family. Merritt continued to maintain his
innocence after the verdict. His attorneys pursued appeals, arguing that errors had occurred during the trial and the evidence did not conclusively prove he committed the murders. As with many high-profile criminal cases, legal proceedings then continued beyond the initial conviction, and questions raised by the defense remained part of the ongoing appellate process.
And for the McStay family's relatives, the conviction brought a measure of closure, but not an end to the AE.
Because pain. They had spent years not knowing what happened to Joseph, Summer, Gianni, and Joseph Jr., and years more waiting for the criminal case to move through the courts. The long investigation, the discovery of, then the graves, and the lengthy trial had all taken an enormous emotional toll. The McStay case remains one
And of the most discussed family murder investigations in modern California history. It began with a simple question: where did?
Then the family go, and eventually became a complex prosecution involving forensic evidence, financial records, digital data, and years of
investigative work. Whether viewed as a tragic story of betrayal, a lesson in the importance of persistence in
and missing person investigations, or a controversial circumstantial case, the murders of the McStay family continue to fascinate true crime, then audiences across the United States. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the case is how ordinary everything appeared, because at first, a family disappeared from a suburban home, their dogs were left behind, their business suddenly went
silent. And for years, no one knew that the answers were buried in a remote stretch of California.
Then desert. The mystery that once seemed to point toward a voluntary disappearance or a trip to Mexico ultimately revealed a far darker reality, one that investigators spent nearly a decade uncovering before presenting their case to a jury. The conclusion of the trial did not erase every question surrounding the McStay family murders. Then complex homicide cases built largely on circumstantial evidence, the verdict sparked continued debate among legal analysts, true crime, because researchers and members of the public. Some believed the prosecution had successfully connected the evidence into a compelling
narrative that explained both the motive and the opportunity. Others questioned whether there were still unanswered questions about
but exactly how the crime unfolded. Regardless of where those opinions fall, one fact remains undisputed. On a February
day in 2010, an entire family disappeared, and more than 3 years later they were found buried in
shallow graves in the California desert. It is a tragedy that forever changed the lives of everyone because I knew them. One of the most significant lessons from the McStay investigation is the role that technology played, and in modern criminal investigations. Detectives did not rely on a single piece of evidence or one dramatic breakthrough. So instead, they spent years examining thousands of pages of financial records, business documents, cell phone activity, computer data, and surveillance footage and witness interviews. Every digital footprint became another clue. In today's world, investigators often reconstruct a
person's final days through electronic records rather than eyewitness testimony alone. Phone calls, emails, GPS data, bank transactions.
Because surveillance cameras can reveal patterns that would have been impossible to uncover decades ago. The McStay case demonstrated how those seemingly ordinary records can become essential pieces of a criminal investigation. Another aspect that continues to fascinate investigators is the timeline surrounding the family's disappearance. According to the prosecution's theory presented at trial,
because the murders occurred shortly after the family's last known communications on February 4, 2010. Yet because there were
no eyewitnesses to the killings themselves, investigators had to carefully reconstruct events using indirect evidence. This required forensic, experts, financial analysts, digital specialists, and detectives to work together over many years. Their task was not only to identify a suspect, but also to convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt that the evidence pointed.
And to one conclusion. The defense, meanwhile, consistently argued that important questions remained unanswered. Throughout the investigation and trial,
however, the individual continued to deny responsibility, and the defense challenged the prosecution's interpretation of the available evidence. And the evidence, arguing that there was no confession, no eyewitness to the killings, and no definitive forensic evidence, then placing him at the exact location where the murders occurred. Following his conviction, Merritt exercised his legal right.
Because to appeal, as is common in serious criminal cases, appeals focus on whether legal errors occurred during the
trial, not simply whether people disagree with the verdict. Those proceedings are part of the normal judicial process, then designed to ensure that convictions comply with constitutional standards. For the McStay family's relatives, however, legal debates could, never replace what had been lost. Joseph and Summer were more than names in court documents. They were.
And parents raising 2 young sons while building a family business. Gianni and Joseph Jr. were children whose futures
then ended before they had the chance to truly begin. Friends and family members who testified throughout the investigation, often spoke about ordinary memories, birthday celebrations, family gatherings, and daily routines that suddenly became precious because they could and never happen again. Those personal memories served as a reminder that behind every headline and every courtroom proceeding, then are real people whose lives cannot be reduced to evidence exhibits or media coverage. The case also illustrates how quickly assumptions can shape public opinion during missing person investigations. In the early weeks after the McStays disappeared,
and the surveillance footage near the US-Mexico border generated enormous speculation. Many believed the family had voluntarily left the
television commentators debated whether they had started a new life elsewhere, while online forums produced countless theories about why they might have disappeared. In hindsight, investigators determined that those assumptions were not supported by the full body of evidence. The case became an important reminder that early theories, especially in high-profile investigations, often
then change as additional facts emerge. Detectives must follow evidence rather than speculation, even when public attention is focused.
Elsewhere, the McStay murders have since been featured in documentaries, investigative television programs, podcasts, books, and countless discussions, and within the true crime community. The story continues to attract attention because it combines several elements that rarely then occur together. The disappearance of an entire family, years of uncertainty, a remote burial site, a lengthy investigation.
In a murder prosecution built largely on circumstantial evidence. Unlike many cases where investigators identify a suspect almost.
And immediately, the McStay investigation required years of patient work before prosecutors believed they had enough evidence to proceed. Then for law enforcement agencies across the country, the case reinforced several investigative principles. First, missing person investigations should never rely on a single theory too early in the process. Detectives initially explored voluntary disappearance, international travel, financial
motives, and possible foul play before narrowing their focus. Second, preserving evidence, even when its significance is not immediately
then obvious, can become critical years later. Financial documents, digital records, phone logs, and witness interviews collected early in investigation ultimately became central to the prosecution's case. Finally, persistence matters. Some investigations are solved not in days or weeks, but over many years through careful analysis and continued review of existing evidence. The case also
then raises broader questions about trust. Many crimes involving acquaintances or business associates begin with ordinary relationships that appear
completely unremarkable. Friends work together, families socialize, and colleagues conduct business without suspecting that serious conflicts may exist. And beneath the surface, while the overwhelming majority of business relationships never become criminal matters, investigators are trained to then examine financial disputes, personal conflicts, and changing relationships whenever they investigate suspicious disappearances. In the McStay investigation, prosecutors argued that business and financial issues provided an important motive, though the defense strongly disputed that conclusion during Today, the McStay home no longer symbolizes an ordinary suburban life. Instead, it has become associated with
one of California's most memorable family homicide investigations. Yet the true legacy of the case should not be
the mystery or the courtroom drama. It should be the lives of Joseph, Summer, Gianni, and Joseph Jr., and a family whose disappearance mobilized investigators, whose story captured national attention, and whose deaths ultimately prompted years of crime, then legal proceedings in pursuit of justice. True crime stories often focus on perpetrators, investigations, and trials, because victims deserve equal attention. Joseph was an entrepreneur working to grow his business. Summer was a mother raising. And two young boys, Gianni and Joseph Jr., were children with countless experiences still ahead of them.
Then they were before the headlines is just as important as understanding how the investigation unfolded,
Because a decade after the family disappeared, the McStay case continues to be studied by investigators, attorneys, journalists, and true crime enthusiasts. Some examine the forensic evidence, others analyze the legal arguments presented during trial. Still others focus, then, on the investigative timeline and how detectives gradually built their case. Regardless of perspective, the investigation demonstrates both because the strengths and challenges of modern criminal justice. Cases built on circumstantial evidence require juries to carefully evaluate and numerous facts rather than relying on one definitive piece of proof. That process is rarely simple, but it then is central to how many complex homicide cases are resolved. In the end, the McStay family murders remain, because a sobering reminder that appearances can be deceiving. A family living what seemed to be a normal suburban, and life disappeared without warning. Their absence generated speculation that ranged from voluntary flight to international travel before investigators then uncovered the tragic truth buried in the desert. Years of patient investigative work eventually led to an arrest, because a trial and a conviction, but no legal outcome could restore what was taken from Joseph, Summer, Gianni, and Joseph Jr. As we reflect on this case, perhaps the most enduring lesson is the importance of perseverance. Investigators refuse to abandon the search for answers, even after years passed with little progress. Their work, because demonstrates that justice often depends not on dramatic breakthroughs, but on careful analysis, collaboration, and an unwavering commitment, and to following the evidence wherever it leads. Thank you for watching. If you appreciate well-researched, fact-based true crime, then documentaries that examine real investigations with accuracy and respect, consider subscribing for more in-depth stories from across the pond. Because United States. Every case has its own lessons, every investigation has its own challenges, and every victim deserves and to be remembered not only for how their story ended, but for the lives they lived before tragedy struck.